1460 WVOX.
Now, live from Whitney Media, 1460 WVOX, the Greenburgh Report with Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner. You can join in the conversation at 914-636-0110. Now on 1460 WVOX, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning. I'm Paul Feiner, and I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor. And we have a very interesting program today. My guest is Dr. Jennifer Goldman-Wetzler. She's founder and CEO of the Alignment Strategies Group. It's a New York-based consulting group that advises CEOs and their executive teams on how to optimize organizational health and growth. She's the author of Optimal Outcomes, Free Yourself from Conflict at Work, at Home, and in Life. It was selected as Financial Times Book of the Month. She's been a keynote speaker at Fortune 500 companies, public institutions, and many startups. And she inspires audiences of all kinds. She's a counter-terrorism research fellow. She was a former research fellow with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So thank you, Dr. Wetzler, for joining us on this program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you maybe tell us a little bit about your profession?
Sure. Well, I work with leaders in all kinds of different organizations to help them optimize the health and growth of their organizations. And one way that I do that is by helping people have conversations that are difficult to have, whether that's about their need or want to innovate and expand and do things differently than they've done before. And some people think this is a good idea, and some people think this is not a good idea, or they have some kinds of disagreements about the business strategy, or whether conflict comes up due to people's different perspectives because of the roles that they play on senior teams, or because of personality conflicts. My work and my team's work at Alignment Strategies Group is to come in and to help people listen and hear what it is that has been difficult to listen to other people say, and also to speak what has been difficult for them to speak.
Do you feel that many major obstacles be overcome if handled correctly?
Yes, absolutely. I wouldn't be in this business if I didn't.
What's the number one mistake that people make when they are facing a conflict?
The number one mistake people make is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I think that's the definition of insanity, according to some. And so what I advise people to do is to, first of all, before you even try to change anything, just notice what is the pattern that you've gotten stuck in when you're in a recurring conflict with other people. So there are 4 conflict habits that I talk about in the book Optimal Outcomes that I wrote. The first is that we tend to blame other people. The second is we avoid other people to the point where we shut down completely in the face of recurring conflict. The third is some of us blame ourselves. And the fourth is that some of us relentlessly seek to collaborate with other people, even when those people are not interested or not able, not willing to collaborate back with us. So we blame others, we avoid others, we blame ourselves, or we relentlessly seek to collaborate. And if people are interested, they can take a quiz online to find out which one of these 4 is their primary conflict habit. And that's at optimaloutcomesbook.com/assessment. And then you'll find out which one is
yours. If somebody, for example, keeps trying to collaborate when others try to refuse to cooperate, is there ways of overcoming, that and convincing somebody later on to work with them?
Well, yes to the first part of your question and no to the second part possibly. So when you've been trying to convince someone to see it your way and that's not working, you trying to continue to convince them to see it your way, likely not to work as well, right? Probably people listening to this, if that's what you've been doing, you know as well as I do that if it's not working, it's not likely to work at some later point. what is likely to work is just noticing what habit you've been using. You've been trying to convince someone. You've been maybe they might experience you as blaming or attacking them. And so my question to you is, what else could you do instead? So if the first practice in the optimal outcomes methodology simply says notice your pattern, the second practice is do something different. It almost doesn't matter what else you do as long as you do something different. So if you've been relentlessly collaborating, do something else.
We have to take a break, and we'll be back. It's about a 5-minute break with Jennifer Goldman-Wetzler. She's the author of Optimal Outcomes, and she'll help us deal with conflict management. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor. Speak to you in a few minutes.
Now, back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Is Dr. Goldman-Wetzler, and she's CEO of Alignment Strategies Group. It's a New York-based consulting group, and she's the author of Optimal Outcomes, Free Yourself from Conflict at Work, at Home, and in Life. And you can get it. It's Harper's Business, February 25th, 2020, selected as Financial Times Book of the Month. And we're talking about conflict. Practically everybody has conflicts at one point or another, and this book could help you deal with this. Jennifer, what drew you to a career specializing in conflict?
Well, as with many things in life, what drew me was starting from a very young age. I grew up in a family of screamers and door slammers, so I had to learn from a young age how to deal with that on my own. But I also had, on one side of my family, my grandma Florence, who I now refer to as the first conflict whisperer who I knew. She, just by her very presence, was able to calm all the rest of us down. So we'd be driving in the car, and there would be fighting going every which way between my mom and dad in the front and my brother and me in the back, and my grandma Florence would sit in the middle of my brother and me and just say, shh, and she would calm the rest of us down and then tell us a story. So I learned both by having to fend for myself in a family of conflict and also from watching my grandmother as a model. And then, of course, I went on to college to major in social psychology with a focus on conflict, and then did my PhD at Columbia in organizational psychology with a focus on intractable conflict and particularly challenging emotions. So, my career has continued over the last 20 years of my adult life as well.
You mentioned that when you were growing up, your family, if people were getting in arguments, what's the best way for members of families, if people are listening right now, to deal with yelling and screaming among their own family members?
Well, the first thing to do is to notice the dynamic. If you are stuck in what I would call a blame pattern, meaning you've got either at least two or maybe more people whose conflict habit, like we were talking about earlier, is to yell or blame others, you want to first notice that and then ask yourself, what else can I do instead? And of course, this can be very difficult in the heat of the moment if you're, literally noticing this as you're yelling at someone else. So the best recommendation I have is to make it a practice of every day in a proactive way. Sit quietly. And this doesn't have to be for very long. This could be just a minute of just taking a deep breath, noticing the breath going in and the breath going out. Or you could notice what emotions are you experiencing, because sometimes our emotions drive our behavior and we don't even realize that's what's happening. So the more we can notice, oh, now I'm feeling serene. Oh, now I'm feeling angry. Oh, now I'm feeling sad. A lot of times it's actually sadness that's being covered up by anger that's then leading us to yell at other people or aggress against other people. So the first thing is to proactively every day, even for just a minute, it could be while you're brushing your teeth or after you brush your teeth, sit quietly and just notice what you're feeling. That can help a lot.
Do you feel, rather than, say, yell back at somebody, maybe you should just, a couple minutes later, just text them so it doesn't create another outburst?
Yes, especially if that's not something you normally do. So if you always yell at someone and then text and apologize, that's not going to help very much because it's just going to be the same pattern you've been in. But if you normally don't apologize for your behavior, sending an apology, whether it's by text or phone call or in person, can go a long way towards leaving someone else feeling like, things are going to be different. This is different. This is helpful.
What about if somebody keeps yelling and screaming and the person feels that it's unfair yelling and screaming? How do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, if you're in a situation where it's comfortable for you to stay, meaning you're not in potential physical harm way, then if you're, first of all, I will say, especially in times like the ones that we're in right now, if you are ever in the way of potential physical harm, my best advice is call a hotline and get out as fast as you can. You do not want to stay with someone who is so angry that they might actually physically harm you. And even if it's not physical harm, but it's emotional harm, that you feel emotionally someone is treating you in a way that no one deserves to be screamed at on a regular basis or at all. So you can always, leaving, if that leaving is always an option, even if it doesn't always seem that way.
Does the COVID-19 pandemic lead to more conflicts among people?
Yes, I would say so. When you have people stuck at home, there's just so much opportunity for conflict to arise, sadly.
And I guess, people are not used to, people may look forward to shopping or vacations or even taking a break from other family members by going to work. So this is probably a more difficult time for most people, would you think?
Yes, absolutely, I would. Yes. And so given that, I hope everybody listening can remember to do what you can to take care of yourself. These are unprecedented times. And so if you find you need to do more healthy things for yourself, right? We don't want you doing unhealthy things because that will likely just make the situation worse. But something healthy, for example, is if you feel that you can leave your apartment or your house, go outside and take a walk. Even if it's just a short 5-minute walk around the block, getting fresh air, getting sunshine on your face, these things can really help a lot. Calling a neighbor or a friend and just, again, it doesn't have to be long, could be a 5-minute conversation, can really, really help a lot. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself.
Do you think the Zoom conversations help or hurt?
Well, mostly help. But if you're like many of the CEOs and senior executives that I work with, they can hurt in the sense of if they're keeping you stuck sitting all day long staring at a screen, much as many people were probably sitting in meeting rooms before. But I think there's something about sitting in the same place and not moving around and also, using a screen.
We have to take a break, and we'll be back in a few minutes. And my guest is Jennifer Goldman-Wetzler.
1460 WVOX. Now back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning. Interesting conversation with Jennifer Goldman-Wetzler, PhD, author of Optimal Outcomes. And in your book...
Paul, I've lost you. I can't hear what you're asking.
Oh, could you hear me now? I just wanted to ask what a conflict is.
I still don't hear you. I heard you for a second, and now you're cutting out.
Oh, ask about conflict loops. What a conflict loop is.
A conflict loop is when your conflict habit interacts with someone else's conflict habit, you get stuck on what I call the conflict loop, meaning it just goes around and around and around. So if you think of a time where you have the same fight with someone over and over and over again, maybe it's about the dishes in the sink, or now the laundry that's not getting done, or about the kids, or childcare, or anything that you're having the same conversation over and over again and expecting a different result, but you're acting the same way. And that's why it's so important to just notice, what is the conflict habit that we talked about before? Am I blaming other people? Am I blaming myself? Am I avoiding other people? Or am I relentlessly seeking to collaborate with others? And how are they responding to me? So I mentioned the quiz people can take online at optimaloutcomesbook.com/assessment. You can take that for yourself, but you can also ask others to take it if you feel comfortable. And then once you know what your conflict habit is and what their conflict habit is, you'll find out what's the pattern we've gotten stuck on that's perpetuating this conflict loop. And then you know how each of you can get off of it, which is basically just do something different from what you've been doing, and you'll free yourself from that conflict loop.
Is it very hard to get people to change their habits?
No, it's not. Because once you notice what you've been doing, the next time you do that, what will happen is you'll watch yourself fall into it. So it can take some time, and I hope people should not be disappointed if they do see themselves continue to do their habit again. But when you notice yourself falling into it as you're doing it, that's progress. That's a good thing. And then the next time, maybe you'll catch yourself before you even fall into it at all. And you'll ask yourself, what else could I do instead? Or once you fall into it and you see that you did, then that's the moment to ask yourself, oh gosh, we just did it again. What could I do the next time I get triggered in this kind of situation? We're having the same fight about the dishes. For tomorrow, what could I do instead? Maybe I could let my partner know this isn't working for me, and can we brainstorm ideas, right? You could make a collaborative move instead of screaming at him. So you want to think ahead about, what will I do when I'm in this situation again? How could I act differently from how I have before? And so I have absolutely seen people over a very short period of time start doing things differently and moving in freeing themselves from that conflict loop.
That's great. In your book, Optimal Outcomes, you place a priority on conflict freedom over conflict resolution. Could you discuss the differences on that?
Yes. We've been taught, many of us from a very young age over the last many years, that we're supposed to try to resolve conflict. But the problem is sometimes we can't. Sometimes our best efforts fail. We're using win-win negotiation methodologies like we've been taught, and they don't work. And so when that's the case, my advice is stop trying to resolve something that has shown itself to be unresolvable, and instead seek to free yourself from that conflict loop, from that pattern, from that way that you've been doing things the same way and expecting something different as a result. So, and the beauty of conflict freedom is that you can do it on your own terms. You don't need anyone else to change or agree with you. And so on the one hand, as your last question might have, suggested, this can be difficult because changing our own behavior is difficult. However, guess what? It's a lot more difficult to try to change someone else's behavior than it is to try to change your own. You have a lot more control over your own actions than you do over what anyone else does. So that's the beauty of conflict freedom, is you can do it on your own. You can notice, what's the pattern I'm stuck in, and you can ask yourself, what else could I do instead? We haven't talked about some of the other practices in the book, but some of them are extremely powerful. Practices like mapping out the situation and noticing who else is involved, who else might be helpful here. What are the influences in this situation that I might not have noticed before? How could I build my empathy for the other people or person involved so that I see the situation in a completely different way and I free myself just by changing my own perspective? These are very powerful.
So when you were talking about mapping out the conflict, you're talking about identifying people, groups. How do you map out a strategy?
Yes. So very often when we're stuck in recurring conflict, it can seem like it's just me and one other person, like in the examples you were giving before. Well, what if I'm stuck and it's one person yelling at me? It can seem that way, but when we take the time to do what I call map out the conflict, we put other people and places and events and any factors, background, history, on that map that will help us see the situation in a different way. So, for example, if I'm in the book, I talk about throughout the book about a conflict between me and my mom. And at first it seemed like it was just about me and her. But when I mapped it out, I noticed, oh, of course, it's my brother and my father who are involved. I've got to put my grandmother and my aunt on the map who are no longer living. And I noticed, oh, my mother's relationship with her mother and her sister-in-law were very strong. They're not here anymore. She wants something from me to maybe take the place of her relationship with them, which has, of course, never been spoken. But once I noticed that, I thought, you know what, my mom yelling at me is not just about my mom yelling at me. It's about my mom wishing she had someone to talk to the way that she used to have them to talk to. And while I still wasn't happy with how my mom was treating me, I was able to have a new sense of empathy for what my mom must have been feeling and going through. And it didn't take away my pain necessarily, but it did give me a different perspective on the situation. So mapping can be very powerful, and this can happen in a matter of minutes. I've seen people map for 2 minutes on webinars I've been doing recently and have insights that have blown me away. People noticing, oh, my boss is impacted by her boss, and so therefore she's putting pressure on me. And I never thought about it that way before. I thought she was just micromanaging me, but actually it's she's being micromanaged, and then that's translating into me feeling micromanaged. So, it doesn't take away the pain of the boss doing that to me, but it does at least help me understand why she might be doing it, and therefore raises my empathy for her.
That is so interesting. How long did it take you to write the book?
A long time, depending on where you start counting. It was a 13-year process. So I've been teaching this material to graduate students at Columbia University for the last decade, and put the first words on the page 13 years ago. And then it took about a year, a little less than a year, to sit down and write out all the chapters of the book at the end.
I thought that it was interesting that you were a former counterterrorism research fellow for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Did that help you gather information for the book?
Yes, absolutely. I could not have written this book had I not done that fellowship. All of my graduate research was supported by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and it was all about how challenging emotions exacerbate long-term conflicts. So I spent 5 years studying how do we get ourselves stuck in conflict, and now I've spent the last 13 years looking at how do we get out, and that's why I talk about freedom from being stuck.
We have to take one last break, and then we'll be right back with Jennifer Goldman-Wetzler, author of a very interesting book, Optimal Outcomes. I'm Paul Feiner. Back in a few minutes.
Now, back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning. I'm Paul Feiner, and my guests have been Jennifer Goldman-Wetzler, and she's author of Optimal Outcomes. During the break, I was wondering, do you think your book should be required reading for everybody at the United Nations and world leaders, as well as, I'm thinking, could some of your suggestions help resolve some international disputes, the Israeli-Palestinian, the United States-Iranian dispute? I mean, is this something, can you see us resolving that at any time?
Well, yes, to the first part of your question, I do think this book should be required reading, and I would be just delighted if I could be helpful and if this book could be helpful to the international arena. and people who are really feeling stuck in so many places all around the world. So yes, absolutely. And if Paul, you are able or willing to make any introductions, please let me know. I'd be absolutely delighted to help.
Right. Yeah, I guess international conflicts sort of are the same as individual conflicts in some ways. The same emotions and anger and mistrust and miscommunication. It happens everywhere.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. This methodology cuts across all different levels of analysis. So from the bedroom to the boardroom to the international arena and everything in between in the community, absolutely. It's relevant at all levels.
Right. We were talking a little bit before about conflict patterns. Where and how can anyone struggling with recurring conflict begin to identify unconscious habits?
The best thing to do is, again, to go to the website, optimaloutcomesbook.com/assessment, or just go to optimaloutcomesbook.com and go to the resources section, and you'll see the assessments there, so that you can find out for sure which one is the primary conflict habit that you default to. There's also an assessment about emotions, and that helps you find out which of the 3 emotion traps, if any, you tend to fall into. So I talk about the knee-jerk reaction trap, the inaccessible emotions trap, and the lurking emotions trap. And the knee-jerk trap is exactly what it sounds like. We feel an emotion intensely inside, and we respond quickly, outwardly with other people. So if I feel angry, I might yell at others. Versus on the other side of the spectrum, the inaccessible emotions trap is we don't feel our emotions particularly intensely inside, and therefore it's very hard for us to express them. So it's hard for us to express empathy for other people, and it's hard for other people to express empathy towards us because they have no idea what we're feeling because we don't really know what we're feeling. And then somewhere in the middle is the lurking emotions trap, which is we do feel our emotions intensely inside, but we try to hide them and cover them up. And the problem is they ooze out anyway, wreaking havoc on our relationships with other people in ways we don't intend. So each one of these traps is a difficult challenge.
And, we talked a little bit about anger. You mentioned that, before, which usually escalates conflict. But anger could also be used as a positive tool to break out of conflict.
Yes, absolutely.
You highlighted some leaders, world leaders in the nonviolent protest movements. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So if we think about great leaders of the civil rights movements like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks, these are people who for sure felt anger, and they used their anger as a catalyst for constructive social change. And so I'm encouraging all of us to use these people as role models for ourselves, to ask ourselves, if we feel angry, what message is that anger sending us? Typically, anger is sending us the message, there's something not right here, not just, not fair. And so then the next question is, well, what am I going to do about it? What constructive action could I take based on that message? Well, what these great leaders did was they asked themselves, how could I help right this wrong? And they worked very hard to, in nonviolent ways, create constructive change. So if you typically have been, if you typically know that you feel angry and in a knee-jerk reaction, you yell at other people, again, what else could you do instead? What would be a constructive thing to do? Well, you could sit down and directly point out to someone the ways in which the situation doesn't feel fair to you or doesn't seem right. There's something off. Let them know. That's only one option. There are many, many different things you could do. And then, so that's the first piece is you have to sit quietly to even know what you're feeling in the first place. And this doesn't take long. We could even do it right now, right? So just stop and notice and ask yourself, what am I feeling? Am I feeling engaged? Am I feeling bored? Am I feeling excited or tired? Am I feeling sad? Right? Many people are feeling sad these days. There's a lot to feel sad about, and that's okay too.
What about how values
play a role in conflict. And could you talk a little bit about shadow values and the power of honoring them?
Yes. Values typically play a very large role in exacerbating conflict. I distinguish between ideal values and shadow values. Ideal values are those things that we care about in life and we are proud to say we care about. These might be things like love or adventure or leadership, versus shadow values, which are things we care about in life, but we typically are not proud to say we care about, and we're not even able to admit them to our own selves. These are things typically like status, power, control, financial security. And so we push these shadow values down out of our conscious awareness, but the trouble is they ooze out anyway, again, wreaking havoc on our relationships with other people. So my advice is to honor our shadow values, to notice that they've been there all along. Just because we've been pushing them down doesn't mean that they're not there. So, and that they can exist alongside our ideal values, even if they seem to conflict with those ideal values. Like one of my clients had an ideal value of collaboration and a shadow value of authority. He refused to admit that as CEO of the company, he needed to have some authority. He was letting people kind of steamroll over him in a way that wasn't helpful to him, wasn't helpful to them, and wasn't helpful ultimately to the company. So he had to ask himself, how can collaboration and authority sit inside of me at the same time? And he noticed they already had been. He had just been pushing one down. So how could he honor it? The authority, he could say something directly to someone like, it's not okay with me for you to treat me that way. Not okay that we're yelling at each other like this. This doesn't work for me. And in that way of honoring his authority, he was able to produce results on behalf of the company and actually build back his trust and relationship with that person in a way that he had not been able to before.
Right. Another question I had is sometimes walking away from a conflict or ending a relationship may not be the best way to break free from recurring conflicts.
Right. Yes, because we'll pay too many costs for doing so. Typically, the reason we stay stuck in recurring conflict is because if we could have walked away, we probably would have done it a long time ago, or if we felt that we could. Now, in some situations, we don't think we can, and actually we can. And the costs that we'd pay for doing so are less than the costs that we'd pay for staying stuck. But very often, the costs that we'd pay for walking away are very high, and we know it, and that's why we stay stuck. So I encourage everybody, in the last chapter of the book, there's a process you can walk yourself through, and you can actually go online at optimaloutcomesbook.com/resources and download the Reckoning template, which is towards the bottom of that website page, that will help walk you through how to assess what costs you're paying if you stay stuck, what costs you would pay if you try to pursue an ideal future or an optimal outcome, and what costs you might pay if you walk away. And then compare those costs and also compare the benefits, which there's space to do in that template, and see where am I going to pay the most cost to, I think, anticipated costs, and where will I reap the most benefits. And then choose the path consciously that will help you reap the most benefits and pay the fewest costs.
We're running out of time. In the remaining seconds, could you tell us what is your ideal future and how can optimal outcomes help us make it a reality?
My ideal future is a world in which each of us is guided in our behavior by our ideal values, that we're aware of what our shadow values are and we lift those up and recognize them, and that we notice when we're stuck in recurring conflict patterns, in those conflict loops, and we do something different, do something pattern breaking.
Great. This was fascinating. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm going to create a YouTube segment and then share this interview with people who did not hear it directly on WVOX radio today. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been a pleasure. Be well.
Thank you.